I'm thrilled to be back here. I realized that I look forward to this all year long, so when I received a note saying that there might be a chance of returning, I was delighted, and so thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's exciting. I'm at this very moment correcting proofs for my new book called Undocumented Immigrants in an Era of Arbitrary Law, which couldn't possibly be more depressing. But I did want to mention it because it's based in some ways on things that we talked about in the last course. So it's fun for me to be able to turn these things, the work that we've done together, into something lasting. And I, yet again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these matters. That book will be out in the summer, and I'm going to have bodyguards probably for the next years. I'm advocating opening the borders between the U.S. and Mexico. So I've got a lot of friends, the Minutemen and others, who are planning on blowing up my house. So I couldn't be more excited about this. This is actually the third book I've written in which I'm advocating open borders, so I'm getting used to all the accosting and the assaulting. But anyway, we'll see what happens. But what I really love to do is to teach literature, and what I really love to is literature and be in literature. So it's fun to go from the law and literature that we were doing last time to the beautiful literature of the Romantic period leading into the beats. I want to say a couple of things in advance of this. One of them is that I teach a course in the month of May every year for the last 6 years in which we go to Switzerland. I bring students to Switzerland and to France, and we hike through the Alps, and we write Romantic poetry. Somebody's got to do it. It's just And Marcia and I came up with this course in the hot tub in the backyard of our house where we used to live. We were thinking, what would be the ideal course to teach? And we had two options. One of them was about pirates, and we thought we'd go to St. Bart's and so forth. And then we thought, it's probably not a good idea with undergraduates. So, so we decided instead, I used to live in Switzerland and skied and competed in skiing and so forth. So I have very fond memories of Switzerland, but it also connects to a whole series of my personal interests in international law and in the Romantics. So we go every year. I take 22 students. We go to Geneva first, and then we go to Grindelwald and to Chamonix and to Brigg and other areas, and we retrace the steps that were taken by the Romantics. So what I want to talk about with you is in many ways informed by that practice that we do every year. And I feel like it's a practice of going to the places where Shelley and Wordsworth and Byron walked and reading the poetry where they were. So that's going to inform, in a sense, the approach that I'm taking here. It's a very soulful experience to do these walks, as you can imagine. And it's very soulful to go to the places where the works that I'm going to be discussing with you were actually written. And I think for me, it has changed my perception of Romantic poetry. And it's given me a completely different and I think much deeper understanding of what it is that they were encountering up in the Alps and why they were there in the first place. So I will talk about that. And I also want to talk about the kind of revolutionary aspects of the computer. You know, there are computers that like Romantic poetry, and then there are computers that are afraid of it. We'll see if it comes back. If it doesn't, I'll just read to you, which is all the more fun. So I wanted to do this course in order to bring us to the bath of the pleasures of the Romantics, but also to explore a few themes. And one of the themes is the relationship between the Romantics and the Beat generation. This is far from obvious in many ways. The Romantics are associated with and plunge their lives into nature, and the Beats are very heavily associated with New York and with travels and with cars and so forth and so on. So the connection in some ways is not obvious, but I'm hoping to convince you that in fact it's a very powerful and interesting connection that we're pursuing, and that to understand what the Romantics were about in terms of revolution, in terms of finding a new language to express their inner selves, is very much connected to what the Beats were doing 150 or so years later. So, well, you know, what could be more fun than reading? Let me just see if this, I just want to see if this wants to do something. But, I mean, I'm happy to just read this to you. Yeah, all right, to hell with it. All right. So we're going to begin with a magnificently written and unbelievably powerful work called the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. And have you all received the syllabus? Everything that I will talk about is available to you online. But if you wish to buy text, I made a few recommendations as to what you can buy. But it's easy to look these things up. And as you can see, they appear magically on the screen, so you have nothing to worry about. So I'm going to read to you, and reading to you in this particular course is joyful because the prose itself is so magnificent, and the poems are so magnificent. So let's begin with the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth, as you know, was born in... I don't know what the heck you just did. What did you do?
There was just giving you just a message.
All right.
So you just had to X out of it.
All right. Okay. I believe you. Can you just stay right over? No, it's okay. All right. Okay. So now you can see it if you wish. So Wordsworth is born in 1770, and he feels a degree of discontent or frustration with the nature of the highly embellished poems that are being written by his contemporaries leading up to the, let's say, the end of the 18th century. I also would like to suggest that Wordsworth feels a frustration with the empirical world that is favored in the so-called Age of Enlightenment, in which the idea is that truths can be known through empirical analysis, that somehow the world is comprehensible and understandable in very rational terms. This course will in some ways emphasize the irrational, the passionate, dreams, that which exceeds the rational mind. And I will argue that that one of the few connections between the different Romantic poets is their obsession with the passionate, that which is somewhat less tangible than the world of reason. So he is arguing in opposition to a kind of Enlightenment age and casting out to a world that is deeply ensconced in his conception of nature, but he's also casting inwards. And one of the characteristics of all of the Romantics, despite the many differences that we'll talk about, is their interest in themselves. How do I perceive the world? What is my experience of this natural scene? What is it like to watch my brain watch the world? When I met Marcia, there's two courses here. One is there's Marcia, and then there's the Romantics. I'm going to connect them. In the first conversation we ever had, we were at a Ken Sushi, which no longer exists, and we were talking about our fancies and obsessions and so forth. And she told me that her obsession was Shelley, and I told her that my obsession was Byron, and that I had bicycled across Europe by myself following the pathway of Byron, particularly in Don Juan. And she told me that she had spent her youth and subsequently reading Shelley and being interested in the question of, as I now describe it, of what the brain is doing when it's looking at the world. And I think that those are two nice descriptions also of what the Romantics are about. It's very much a contemplative practice that, in a sense, we're describing when we talk about the Romantics. There's a strong interest in the subjective self observing the world. So what you see in the preface to the lyrical ballads is an attempt to break away from the artifice of poetry as practiced by many others, and a kind of a drive inwards to what he deems to be a much more natural language that accords with this effort that he has to understand the world through the workings of his own mind. So it begins at this, and I've highlighted the areas that I want to talk about up here. It begins with this description of the volume of poems. It was published as an experiment, which I hoped might be of some use to ascertain how far, by fitting to metrical arrangement, a selection of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation. It's a beautiful description of the Romantics. So your mind is open. You're open. You're ready. You're observing, and you're letting the world enter into your mind without encumbering that world with préjugés, prejudgments as to what it means. So there's an openness, a kind of youthful openness. I also want to teach this class because of our youth, because we are thinking, what does it mean for us to be young and free and open to the world, all of us? So there's a rather than imposing upon the world a set of beliefs, an openness to what is actually before us. He insists upon that idea, and I love that as a way of describing the world. So and furthermore, it's the real language of men. Now, we could have a debate about this as to whether when you read Tintern Abbey, it sounded like the real language of men. And it's one of the many contradictions of the Romantics. He talks as though, if you got into a bus in Nashville, everybody would be talking like Wordsworth, which seems relatively unlikely, but you never know. Nashville's changing. But what is the natural language of men? And what it suggests is that what you're looking for is a way to express the mind that is appropriate to the material that's being expressed. So you want to, rather than going to the convention of poetry with all of its embellishments and all of the many mechanisms associated with poetry, to find a type of poetry that suits the mind somehow. And this is central to the Romantic project. He then says in this second gray little area here, several of my friends are anxious to the success of these poems, from a belief that if the views with which they're composed were indeed realized, a class of poetry would be produced well adapted to interests of mankind permanently, and not unimportant in the quality and in the multiplicity of its moral relations. And on this account, they have advised me to prefix a systemic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. So he perceives of himself, and here's our first connection to the Beat generation. He perceives of him that he himself is a revolutionary. And what he's doing in renovating poetry is revolutionary. And he fully expects that people will resist this, that people will dislike what he's doing, or perhaps even consider that what he's writing is not poetry, because it's foreign relative to the norms of the period. He's revolutionary in the way that this period is revolutionary. 1789 is the crucial moment of the period that we're talking about. We could also mention 1776, of course, as regards our own country. And by the way, since the last time I saw you, I became an American, which is the strangest thing. I'm not wearing them today, but I have red, white, and blue socks. That my son gave me because he also became an American. We're just always so terrified of being kicked out that I figure at least at least I can stay. It might not be a safe place, but I'll be staying. So yeah, we became, and my youngest son is about to become an American in a few weeks. So your country's going to hell. You might want to. you might want to emigrate now. I think there's more room in Canada now that we've left. But anyhow, yeah. So 1776 may very well be a date, but certainly 1789 is a crucial date. And one of the things that we cannot account for in life is luck. It is, as all of you know, probably the most important thing. We've been lucky. We're lucky. I'm lucky to be here. We're lucky to be together. And who knows what could have happened along the way, but it didn't. Wordsworth, I think of as another person who is lucky. One of the things that you do when you graduate from Cambridge or Oxford in this period is you go on the grand tour. You go on Maymester with Professor Barsky in May, and you go walk around the Alps, except they would do it for like years at a time, which was, I think, an even better idea. So he goes on a walking tour, and when does he go? He goes in 1790. Where does he go? He lands up in Paris. Paris in 1790 was a very good idea, as you can well imagine. The revolutionary fervor, the changes, and as he says, it's the perfect place to be, and it's an even better place to be when you're young, as he was. So he's very much inspired by the revolutionary fervor and the revolutionary time that we're talking about. So the other thing to keep in mind as you read the Romantics is this conception of the revolution. We're rethinking the relationship between the individual and the state, and we're in particular understanding that human beings are human beings. It doesn't matter their class, the color of their skin, the nature of where they come from, or whatever else. People are people. And so much of what we think of when we think of the 18th century is associated with these ideas of democracy, but much more a sense of fundamental human rights and what it means to be human. So all of that is very much tied into some of the things that you're reading here. If you keep going, we have to skip some of it, but he talks here about the gaudiness. They who have been accustomed to the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers, if they persist in reading this book to its conclusion, will no doubt frequently have to struggle with feelings of strangeness and awkwardness. They'll look around for poetry and will be induced to inquire by what species of courtesy these attempts can be permitted to assume that title. That is called writing in English. Shocking. Rather than sending our kids to school, which I'm increasingly against based on what they're learning, we should just give them text like this and just say, just write like this and everything will be fine. The world will be safe. You'll start protecting the environment and loving trees and so forth, and we're all going to be fine. But the writing is just so gorgeous. But to imagine that he considered this period to be one in which gaudiness prevails in the literary domain, and that people who would read his poetry will be shocked to even consider that it's poetry, which is surprising, perhaps, to read. So he then talks about the incidents of common life. Hey, so the subject of the work is common life. And he loves to watch common people do things associated with their ordinary lives and write about how uplifting those activities are. So this idea that he mentions here, the principal object in these poems is to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate them or describe them as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men, and then to color them with imagination. So this is one of the many contradictions, another one of the many contradictions of the Romantics. On the one hand, this seems to be accessible to everybody. Right? He's just writing the way we all talk. Well, that's not really true. And second of all, the people who he's admiring, the people out working in fields and so forth and so on, although they are engaged in tasks of ordinary life, most of them don't know how to read. Right? And certainly what he's doing at this great distance is very foreign to them relative to their actual lives. So on the one hand, he has this kind of wide-eyed childhood wonder where he says, let's just all be children. Let's just all be young. Let's just all be open. Let's live freely and so forth. But on the other hand, he's in a very privileged situation as the kind of observer of the world. And he really does look at, say, a family working in the field and romanticizes them. what a wonderful life, they're connected to nature and so forth, when in fact, as you know, they were starving and they're sick and life was very difficult and so forth and so on. So you get this complicated contradiction that's going on in this world. The other thing that he has is this idea of the childhood wonder, so that you try to recapture what it's like to be youthful, right? As though youth is filled with knowledge. I think we could have a debate about that. But one of the images that I love of the Romantics that comes from Wordsworth is this idea of a kid spinning around on skates and then stopping and then looking at the same world, but now it's spinning around. That's a great image, I think. And it's going to connect to the Beat Generation, because they're going to do the same thing, except they're going to do it with LSD and marijuana and peyote and all sorts of other stuff. But they're doing the same thing. They're looking at the same world, but with fresh eyes. Okay, that's another crucial notion of the Romantics. You're trying to figure out how to make your ordinary life sublime, how to make your ordinary life to be filled with the beauty of encountering it for the first time, the kind of freshness. So how do you do that? You can do it with poetry. As we'll see with the Beats, you can do it with drugs. As we'll see with the Beats, you can also do it with, say, traveling. Right? You change the nature of your relationship to the environment in which you normally dwell, so forth. And then, as we'll see next week, you can also do it by standing on cliffs and being scared to get too close because you might fall over and die, which is why we used to ski. We had a theory which we all had this place where if we were injured, we would be killed by our friends. Because our theory was either you ski, you run, you do unimaginably dangerous things, you jump off gigantic cliffs, and you ski down avalanches and you have the best time of your entire life, or you die. And anything in between was not acceptable. So we had this promise that we had made if we got severely injured, that we each had a place where a cliff that we would be brought to and thrown off by our friends. It was really youth, you know. Yeah, sounds crazy is what and I still kind of think that that's a nice, well, it's probably not a good way to live, but it somehow seems connected to this. But in the sense that you're looking for that burst, that connection to profundity that nature and that life can offer. And you see this very strongly in here. So he does so, Shelley is going to be a little bit more dramatic. He does so much more in the kind of, okay, let's calm down now. Let's look at what's actually there, right? Let's contemplate. Let's learn how to slow things down. There's something very spiritual about reading Wordsworth. Slow things down, understand our relationship to what it is that we're looking at, and learn to allow the world to come at us. So when he says, humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. Because the manners of rural life germinate from these elementary feelings, and from the necessary character of rural occupations are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that condition the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So there's a theory here that underwrites this, which maybe we could ascribe to the idea of authenticity. There's authenticity in nature. There's authenticity in the experience of being in the woods and listening to the birds and smelling the trees and so forth. Or there's an authenticity in the actions of rural life in which you're milking the cows or taking care of the farm that is authentic, it's real, it's not the rushed, crazy pace of the cities which he so hated, as we'll see, the kind of hustle and bustle of crowds, which later on in the modern world become the subject of the poetry. We think, for example, of Baudelaire and his in particular, his prose poems, which celebrate things like crowds. Wordsworth has no time for crowds. It's the opposite of what he was interested in. He loves, I use the word spiritual, but it's kind of a natural spirit. It's the spirit of nature and the spirit of memory and the spirit of the inside of one's own body. So he suggests here that you're more open to philosophical contemplation of a profound and permanent sort when you are away from artifice, okay, when you are close to nature. We're going to see this in a moment in his magnificent poem on Tintern Abbey. So in the next really crucial lines, and again, this is very, what I'm talking about here is true of the Romantics generally, but there's going to be important variation from, say, Byron to Wordsworth, as we'll see. But some of these notions apply all the way across the board, but this is another crucial point. For the human mind is capable of being excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants. He must have a faint perception of its beauty and dignity who does not know this, and who does not further know that one being is elevated above another in proportion as he possesses this capability. Learning how to hold somebody's hand in nature as you sit together and feel the warmth of the sun and smell the grass and just be and feel is not given to everybody. And to the degree that you are open to the beauty of the world that surrounds you, open to the magnificence of nature and so forth and so on, to the degree that you allow yourself to feel and express, you are, from the perspective that's being described here, elevated above everybody else. The better you are at that, the closer you are to the ideal. What is the ideal of the poet? The poet is the ultimate arbitrator of that ability, of the ability to experience fully and then represent that experience to us all. It's something. So we need to. This is a very contemplative part of the course, is to be with Wordsworth. So when we go hiking, and what we do is we actually follow where Wordsworth walked with his sister, Dorothy, who is the true love of his life, and we're going to be talking about a lot of scandalous things, for which I apologize. But Dorothy really was his companion and the true love of his life. We went in the second or third year that we went hiking with students in Switzerland. We did a 22-kilometer hike from Brig to the Simplon Pass. And we followed the exact pathway that he had taken with Dorothy, beginning in Brig all the way up. Absolutely amazing. And what we would do is exactly what he would do, which is you walk, and the moment you feel overwhelmed, overcome, you allow yourself to just stop and feel, and in certain cases write. It's a very exciting and edifying way to be in the Alps, that's for sure. And sometimes you don't feel like going anywhere. And sometimes you feel like, stopping at great vistas. And sometimes just the movement of walking is itself very inspiring. But anyway, we did what he did in several days in one, and it was absolutely magnificent. So the problem for Wordsworth is, in a sense, the problem for Wordsworth is the modern world. In a sense, the problem for Wordsworth is industrialization, the devastation of the environment, the rat race, and so forth. And he and Coleridge were very, I think, aware of this. The Lake District is this very beautiful, I'm sure a lot of you have been there, very beautiful, very serene. But, during this period, Manchester and London were just crazy, the centers of the modern world, choked with soot and the coal dust and so forth. And people hustling and bustling, and so it must have felt very claustrophobic for him. So he says, and the examples are hilarious in here, the most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place and the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident. So because you're forced into this homogeneity of the modern world, the only way you can break out is through, you go home at night and you watch Fox News or something, right, of the 19th century, which this turns out to be, as you'll see, certain types of German literature. But this need to watch car accidents or watch the Weather Channel. You get glued to, there's red stuff coming and yellow stuff coming, and there's flashes, and you go outside. It's like a perfectly normal day. You're just, you think, what is wrong with me? I've been terrified to even go outside. Oh, okay, there's a quarter of an inch of ice outside. Well, good. I can have a martini or something. Calm down, right? But there is that. And we love to think that I don't know why we love to think that this might be our last day on earth, because we might fall down the steps of our house or something like that, and then the entire street will collapse. I don't know what we're thinking, but there's something in the news channels that does that to us. And he's talking about exactly the same thing, although his examples are not exactly the same, with which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies to this tendency of life and manners. He would have loved the internet, right? Here, the communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. A letter still takes 3 days to get down the street. Here, we're talking about instantaneous. But anyway, this tendency of life and manners, the literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves. The invaluable works of our elder writers, I've almost said the works of Shakespeare and Milton, are driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse. We become crazy. We just consume stuff that gets us all very excited, instead of just calming down and realizing the beauty of nature. So what you need is to learn a kind of reflection, a kind of meditative reflection. And a lot of this will take place in what he talks about, which is memory, as we'll see in a moment. So I've outlined in yellow here one of the words that he says. To these qualities he's added a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things as if they were present. So a lot of Wordsworth talks about memory and the relationship between the self and that which the self has experienced in the past. The mining of the brain, which is a magnificent ability to have, to experience the world both in the present but also in a kind of constant communication with the past. And a little bit later on, we come to what I think to be the seminal, the ultimate description of the Romantic period. I have said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Every word there is crucial. It's spontaneous. It's not induced. So being open to the world allows for this welling up inside of you, this spontaneity. It sounds like a good love affair, right? It's not forced. You're not compelled. You're not doing it because you're supposed to do it. You're not being told what to think. It's a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And an overflow, like it's overabundant, you have to get it out. Is another beautiful notion. This idea of abundance that's inside of you. And then powerful feelings. And what's interesting about those powerful feelings is that they're stimulated by just the majesty of a leaf or the beauty of the smell of dew on the grass. And that induces this powerful overflow. So I think that's a really crucial moment. And now we come to the best part of this course, which is the actual writing. So if this is your theory, this is what you're dealing with. This is the nature of the world that you're proposing. So what does it look like when you engage in the practice of writing based on these assumptions? So what we've looked at, in some ways, is a kind of manifesto. And I look at it as a kind of manifesto of how to live. Live in accordance, in calm, but in kind of harmony with nature, with respect, and with openness, but also with an understanding that you are in existence in relationship to the mind that occupies your body and the body that surrounds your mind. So there's a strong awareness in all of his writing of his being in the world. There are some of the most beautiful lines and I hope that this is, I assume that this is going to be correct in the way that this works. Yeah, I guess so. Okay. So we'll be a little bit indulgent in this course. Indulgent means that we read together because it's blissful. There are very few examples in the language that are more beautiful than the words written by Wordsworth here for his sister at Tintern Abbey. So the scene is, Tintern Abbey, if you've ever seen it, is a kind of dilapidated or kind of falling down kind of ruin that he had visited in the past with his sister in a very beautiful part of England. So the lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July the 13th, 1798. So he loved these tours. It would get him out into nature, and he would walk around. Obviously, again, it's yet another one of the contradictions of this. This is not given to everybody. The course that I teach in May costs $10,000. So here we are advocating for people to go out in nature and like be free and be open and so forth, and we're paying $10,000. It's one of the endless contradictions of, or we live, as far as I'm concerned, I have to talk about this someday. Vanderbilt is more or less a socialist society, right? It's everything that apparently people are love to hate. We've got universal health care, right? You've got abundance of food, and environmental respect. It's a perfectly normal place. Public transportation's there. It's 24 hours a day, just about. And we got a hospital that's open to everybody, and it's a society the way societies are supposed to be. The only problem is you pay $60K a year to be there, and then when you leave, you're like, no, I don't think we should have universal health care. Why? You just had it. Didn't you like it? God. So anyhow, the weirdest thing. But anyway, so it's one of the many contradictions, again, that we're dealing with here, which is that it sounds like we should all just do this. Like all of us ought to just go to Switzerland and hike around. I mean, obviously. Of course, you go for a pizza, it's like $80 for a pizza. So you have to eat each other or something. But anyway, so we're going to go into nature, and we're going to live in the lush, beautiful, gorgeous memories that he has of being there in the past. So it's a strange experience, which is that he both sees what is around him while he watches his own mind seeing. So he's living it two times at once. I realized this once with my children, who are, I'm not going to say grown up because I can't accept it somehow, but when I look at my children, my eldest is 26. When I look at him, I see him at every age. I remember the day that he was born, and I remember every single day since when I look at him. It's true, I'm sure it's true for all of us. So you live in the present and in the past simultaneously. It's a magnificent experience, I think. Well, in some cases, it's horrible. You get to know, you think, you think about one of your enemies and all the horrible times you've had with that person. Well, that's another matter. This is not a course on my new book, although it's obligatory reading, in case you're wondering. There's a sign-up sheet for you to buy it. You get the library edition too, which is only about $150. I realize that if I sell 1 million copies of these things, I'm going to be able to buy a house, which I'm looking forward to. I know 1 million people want to find out about open borders. They're just dying to know that. But 5 years have passed. 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows. Little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. One of the beautiful and shocking ways in which Wordsworth experiences the world is that he experiences it and you feel as though you're alongside him. And to me, one of the most surprising lines in all of English poetry, or all of poetry, is the rather surprising line 4 lines from the bottom. Once again I see these hedgerows. You've seen hedgerows in England. These amazing, beautiful, the hedges are used to separate the fields and so forth. Once again I see these hedgerows. Okay, that's the declarative statement. There they are. There's those hedgerows again. And then he says, actually, it's not true. They're not hedgerows. They're hardly hedgerows. Once again, I see these hedgerows. Hardly hedgerows. Let me take another look. Hold on 2 seconds. I always thought that they were hedgerows. Hold on a second. What are they actually? Oh, they're lines of sporting wood run wild. Huh. That's amazing. So he doesn't then go back and take an eraser and get rid of the first thought. He leaves it. This is my first impression. And now that I've clarified it, I realize that it's more like little lines of sporting wood run wild, as though the wood itself can run around, which is gorgeous. And that's something that you're going to see. We're going to see this next week like crazy when we're looking at Shelley. Shelley, who looks up at Mont Blanc and says, wow, isn't that magnificent? It must be the work of... Oh, no, wait a second. Hold on 2 seconds. Now, this is not at all what I expected. Hold on. Let me look a little more closely. And that's, I think, archetypical of what it is that he's talking about. Don't just say, this is beautiful because of nature or God or something. No. Actually look to see what's there. It's actually these little lines of sportive wood. And then again, some of the themes that we've seen. These pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. So it's a true pastoral image. It's gorgeous, so beautiful. What's going on in the house with all the difficulties and so forth? He knows. He's not. Whether or not he knows anything about it, it's certainly not the subject of the poem, and seldom is in this work. With some uncertain notice, I'm assuming that we're going here. I want to make sure that we're not losing anything. Me and technology in this particular course. Perfect, okay. With some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft, in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. So when things have been difficult, when he's been in horrible places like cities, he has gone back into his mind and said, just hold on a second, I'm going somewhere else. I'll meet you in a little while, okay? Just calm down. And he goes into his memory, and he recreates this in his mind. So he's reviewing, he's revisiting that which is already inside of him. It's a very 18th century conception, by the way. This idea that in some senses the world is known to you. Inside of your own mind, you already have so much that is your endowment. That it's not so much that you review the world, but the nature of your brain is so complex at birth that you're the opposite of a blank slate. So this idea of reviewing is crucial, it would seem to me. It is an obsession in the 18th century, not surprisingly. Feelings, too, of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no sight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. That's what life is. And what I find interesting and beautiful here is, and you'll hear this very strongly in Shelley, but the relationship between religion and the Romantics, I think, is a troubled one. Shelley has an overt dislike for organized religion, but I think so too in many ways is Wordsworth. Although he's talking in ways that sound religious and very spiritual, he does so in regards to the natural world and in regards to his relationship to it in an unmediated fashion. And I think that for him, this is important because it means that there's no predetermined truths. He experiences the world as it exists out there. He's not sanctifying or celebrating or edifying something else on the basis of what he's been told. He's allowing the world to come into him. There's something I think really powerful and very, it's his version, I think, of spirituality. Nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime. That blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. While with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. It's so beautiful. It's in that tranquility, in that seeking, that you actually can penetrate into the true life of things. So there is and you're going to see this in the Beats, who defy the difficulties of being inside of a noisy city and so forth, but still manage to find this. There's a wonderful poem about a sunflower that Ginsberg finds with his friend Jack as they're walking along a railway track, and he talks to the sunflower. It's magnificent. I mention it now because when you come to it, I want you to think back to this. But this idea that you can, through a kind of meditation, a kind of inward meditation, understand the true life of things. If this be but a vain belief, yet, oh, how oft, in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan why? O wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee? There too, an unmediated repetition. Oh, 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 oh. Right? Once was not enough. Right? That it's so powerful that it's worth repeating. It's worth doing it again. And what the heck? Right? I'm not going to stand on ceremony here. This is how I feel, and it's bloody awesome, and that's okay. Right? And now, with gleams of half-extinguished light, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again. So you see this strange movement. Now, there's the picture inside of the mind that comes back, even as he's looking at the picture outside of his mind. Well, here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. Here he does sound like a person just speaking. But how beautiful. What a beautiful way to speak. But this realization that this moment is so beautiful, so powerful, so rich, so magnificent, that it's actually, I'm going to store it so I can go back to it a little bit later on. That is a magnificent, I think, conception. And so I dare to hope, though changed, no doubt from what I was when first I came these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. So, on the one hand, he celebrates being a child. But on the other hand, he knows that when we're children, we're like bouncing off the walls, right? And that, yeah, he remembers doing that, but he never, he recognizes that he was quite different back then. For nature then, the coarser pleasure of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. And needless to say, just the organization, you could say, well, why poetry? Why poetry? Why doesn't he just write this out? If you've been noticing where the lines end, it's a shocking characteristic. It's very difficult to define what poetry is, but one of the things you can say about poetry is that it's constituted in lines. So it's clear that what matters is the lines. Right? And if you look at the difference between I cannot paint what then I was, which is a beautiful line, and I cannot paint. Right? You come to the end of the line. I cannot paint what? What can I paint? And you're in this white space. I cannot paint. I cannot what? What can't you paint? And you stay there for a moment, and you realize what it means to end the line with that painting. I cannot paint. I cannot, like that anxiety. And then you allow yourself to change lines. I cannot paint what then I was. And that I cannot paint what then I was. I cannot paint what then I was. But these are two, they're separated by space. Or in this particular conception, they're separated by time. They both have the same meter. And they're both connected to the same sentence, as it were. But in poetry, you can do completely different, you can create completely different moods and meanings. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, not any interest unborrowed from the eye. Why? Because nature to me was all in all. We don't even know what that means. Nature was all in all. But you know exactly what it means. That's the other amazing thing about poetry, is that he teaches you how to read and how to think. But he also, when he comes up with lines like what we just saw, that nature was to me all in all, you know exactly this kind of wholeness that he's describing. That time is past. I'm sorry. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzying raptures. Not for this faint eye. Again, not for this faint eye. Nor mourn, nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. And here's another unbelievably beautiful, shockingly, you want to start memorizing stuff? This is the stuff to memorize, I think. To read something over and over again, which we do in certain cases, like, for example, the stock market. It's the weirdest thing, right? If you actually pay attention to this, oh, unemployment is down, the stock market's up. 3 days later, unemployment is up, so the stock market's down. And then you get some sort of an analysis of this. You're like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. 3 days ago, you said exactly the opposite. There's this article that came out, I think, the other day in the New York Times saying, there's not a single hedge fund that beats the market, not one. Not one. There's not a single expert on Wall Street who invests money for you and makes more money than the stock market had you just randomly thrown darts at the thing. You would have necessarily done probably better, and you wouldn't have paid anything. It's like the weirdest thing. Why did I mention that? Who knows? Not for this faint eye, nor more nor murder, other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe, abundant recompense. This is worth reading over and over again. Not the lies that they tell us about Wall Street. That's what I was trying to say. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. Dash. We got there's a dash on Buttrick Hall. You've seen the dashes because we have Emily Dickinson over there. Right? The mind is wider than the sky. Dash. Like, what's a dash? You know what the end of a line is? It's like staring down before you. You know, you're looking at a cliff or something. Here's a dash. Right in the middle. To chasten and subdue. And then you kind of just wallow there in that dash. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive. Well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul of all my moral being. So it is this contemplative, soulful, spiritual, but he also is literally describing what we talked about as regards the preface. That in nature he finds a complete understanding of the nature of the universe. It's an unmediated understanding. And that unmediated understanding is itself worth the life that he lives, both for what he experiences at any given moment and for what it has taught him about the past. I would like to continue this all day, but I assume that there's a time when I have to stop, but I don't know what that is. Is there a time that I'm supposed to, once we're here, we can just stay. Do we have an hour that I'm supposed to do something at? Oh, fantastic. Okay, 11:45, perfect. 12:45, great. Okay, that should do it. All right. It's a good thing my hearing is going, all these years. Nor perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river. And it's so fascinating that he introduces the thou here without any preface. We don't know Thou? Well, who's the thou? If you were reading this for the first time, and if you were reading it slowly and attentively, I would guess you would think that it's you. We're with him. So this is another complicated part of this poem. He has come back to a place to which he has returned frequently. So it's about his memory. And as he's describing it, we are joining him. There's an unbelievably amazing, crazily, outrageously magnificent line that also doesn't make any sense in English literature, in Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, in which Keats, who's been listening to this nightingale singing outside, he was at a cottage of a friend's house, and he went outside and he heard this nightingale. And he stares at it and he thinks about it. And at one point he goes, "Already with thee, tender is the night." So at that point, he becomes the nightingale in some way. And then at the end of the poem, he flies off. The nightingale flies off, and he realizes he's no longer the nightingale. But already with thee. There's been some sort of a symbiotic relationship that's developed. And then the night has become tender. We all know exactly what that means, but it actually makes absolutely no sense. You know exactly what a tender night is. You've had tender nights. We love tender nights, but you know, it doesn't make any sense, like the best things in life. So now we have joined him, and he says, "Thou art with me upon the banks." I feel like he's talking to me. I'm like, "Yeah, William, I am with you. This is awesome. Thank you for having me join you. Of this fair river, thou my dearest friend." And then goes, "This is even better." "My dear, dear friend." I'm like, wow, this is getting great. Right? So you feel this increasing symbiotic connection to this guy. Right? "And in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister." Oh, all right. All right, okay. All right. So now you realize that he's been joined by you, and he's been joined by the memory, but he's also joined by Dorothy. And Dorothy, having been there with him, is necessarily intricately associated with the place. So he can't extricate his memories of that place from his memories of her. And that's one of the beauties here too, is this idea of love. And it's one of the pains of loss. But it's also one of the powers of poetry. Elegiac poetry, and in fact much of the poetic tradition, is based on the idea that in the word there is a remnant of, or a representation of, or a symbol of, or the possibility of that to which the word refers. So in the same way that all language is referential, poetry is particularly referential. So what you try to do with poetry is you try to do the ultimate, achieve the ultimate dream, which is to be able to say something and have it happen. Right? That's called power. Right? So if you're missing somebody in the night and you call out to them, you disturb all the people in the hotel around you, but you somehow believe or wish that if you can just say those words that he'll appear or she'll appear. Right? The invocation. And if the person can't appear, then at least her name can stand in for her absence. One of the reasons why you invoke in the first place. But it's certainly one of the reasons why you write poetry. And it's certainly one of the reasons why you write poetry in the absence of somebody, either because of their passing or because of their distance. So it's this, and you can see the seeds of that here, the power of this in his invocation of his sister. And this prayer I make, and it's a prayer, it's a nature, it's a prayer into his own psyche. It's not I don't think it's an organized religion prayer. It's a prayer as in making manifest that which one believes or hopes or dreams, in this case. knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy. For she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us, or disturb our cheerful faith, that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief shall be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me and these my exhortations? Nor perchance, if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget what on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together. So he's creating here he's recreating here his relationship with his sister. But there's also the sense that he's aware that he's creating a poem, that he's creating an artwork that will last. He's creating a memory in these words that can be held on to subsequently. There is a tangible nature to what he's describing here. And that I, so long a worshiper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service. Rather say with warmer love, oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love. So you notice again the religious terminology here, but all directed towards nature. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. Both for themselves and for thy sake. So the inextricable link created between his love for her, his experiences with her, his endless connection to her in absence and in presence, ties them both to this scene. But at the same time, and this is the next way in which I think the Romantics connect to the beats, we now feel connected to it as well. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine in the modern world the degree to which art was directed to or sanctioned by authority, which means that so much art was either connected to the church or the state or the aristocracy, and now it's connected to people who live their lives, people like you and me. And all of a sudden, we, hundreds of years later, sitting in this room together in deep meditation, are contemplating this magnificent place, and we care about Dorothy, his sister. We may never have heard about Dorothy. She was Wordsworth's sister, for lots of things. But now we care. He's teaching us to care about the simple things in life, but he's also elevating his world and his experience so that we can feel a part of it. I take the Romantics in some ways to also offer us that gift of understanding that our own lives also matter. There is a way in which, and this is even more true I think in the Beats, there's a way in which this type of writing makes you want to write. Rather than making you feel oppressed, where you kind of go, oh God, That was really beautiful. I think I'm going to go home and cry because I'll never be able to do this. It's amazing how enabling this is. And you think, well, that's a Sylvan Y that he's experienced. What about my memories? What do I care about? And who do I care about? And the ability to then transform this experience into the enablement of writing your own experiences, I think something to be very powerful. And the Beats, with their kind of journal keeping and their, in some ways, these were journalers also. The Prelude was certainly a journal. He walks around, and that's one of the things I've learned in the Alps. He walks around and he looks at things, and if you look at what he's written and you look at the thing, you're like, yeah, it's obvious, like right there. I could have written that. I could have written that, right? Which is, obviously not in this form, but there's something. It's cool to feel connected like that, and the effect that it has upon people, in my experience, has been to empower them to create beauty, and in regards to that which surrounds us, rather than in regards to, some princely or rich or whatever famous person. Who cares? We can talk about our own little worlds. That's, I think, a great gift to the Romantics. So here are these young kids, as you know, almost all the Romantics are dead before they're 30. Wordsworth is not dead before he's 30. He actually lives a long life, but he keeps revising his stuff and kind of ruins it. I think this is a poetry of the youth in some ways, because it's filled with this ecstasy. But I think, as such, it's also a very inspiring poetry for all of us. And I think that it resonates far beyond its moment. So I hope that not only will this be for you a memory of us here created on this cliff, but also an enabling force for you to be writing your own worlds in your own words as we work through the next 50 weeks together. Are there any quick, yeah? Tiny.
How many people were in the public who could understand what he was saying, and was he able to support himself through the sale?
Yeah, he did receive I think it was 900 pounds on the publication of his first works, but he came from a well-to-do family. He grew up in a kind of mansion, despite the fact that I think there were 6 kids. And it was a tiny little population who went to Oxbridge, as you know. And the works that we read, the Norton Anthology of this period, is filled with people who went to Oxbridge. So, yeah, we're talking about a tiny, 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 growing, but tiny, tiny, tiny segment. So it's a transitional moment between when you relied upon the aristocracy to support you as an artist, or you just had money, and when you started making money from your writings. Byron would be an example of somebody who lands up making a lot of money from his writings. He inherits a kind of dilapidated mansion and so forth. But most of his money he actually makes by selling. But this is a transitional moment. And it's going to lead us, you're looking here at the beginning of the 19th century. By the time we get to Dickens, 50, 60 years later, he's making, his fortune was in the tens of millions of dollars. Just because of the way he did the sales and because of the growing literacy in England and amongst the Anglo populations, including here. So yeah, it's a revolutionary moment, and in some ways marked by 1789. The idea that everybody should read, that everybody should feel part of the state, and that we shouldn't have this, Downton Abbey separation, right? This is a transitional moment, I think, but it's a hugely important question. Yeah. That's so true. Right. Yeah. That is so true. It's so true. And I've always absolutely loved this poetry ever since my teenage years. Two things have happened with our hikes in Switzerland. One of them is I've come to appreciate some of them more, and the other thing is that I've come to appreciate other ones less. Mont Blanc, which we'll talk about next time, is mind-boggling. And it's mind-boggling. I stood at above the Rivière Arve last year and read it. It defies the imagination. The Simplon Pass, a lot of his ramblings and walkings and so forth, they're somehow unsatisfactory compared to what's out there. There's so much more. So, which has been for me kind of enabling, because you can feel crushed by Wordsworth because his writing is so beautiful. But in fact, if you're actually out there, you can. It's not that you can do better, but you can do, which is cool. But yeah, it's an interesting. I did another tour with Marcia. We went to Ireland, which is where I bought that coat that I somehow made. And I read Yeats everywhere that he had written his poems. And there you think, he had this ability to draw things from the ground and from moments that is absolutely astonishing. The stuff to hear that's on the move it's true, it's somewhat unsatisfying. So it's an interesting point, but yeah.
What's the significance of capitalization of certain nouns? I noticed reader and writer.
Yep.
And nature.
Yep.
And sister.
Yep.
And wow.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, nature you can sort of imagine. And maybe the answer would be different one from the other. Sister, I think, is different than nature in terms of the capitalization. It is, I don't know, I think we could speculate more than find an answer for it. If it's sister if it's a capitalized sister, then it is a particular person, I think. It's not a sister, it's her, who he doesn't name. Yeah, well, a lot of the meditations during this period are about the nature of the poet. What is a poet? What is the poet? And what is the role of the poet? And who is the poet? Shelley, in Defense of Poetry, goes on endlessly about that and capitalizes the same words. So maybe it's, maybe the institution is being asked. What is the institution of nature? What is the institution of the poet? What is the institution of poetry? What do they mean? Maybe that's a way to think about it. But yeah, I think there's different ways we could imagine. All right, she's saying we got another 3 hours, so take your time. Gin and tonics are in the back. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes.